who received an unusual nickname for a climber, the Black Widow. Mountaineer Chantal Mauduit was born in France, in the foothills of the Alps. Therefore, she was familiar with winter sports from early childhood. From downhill skiing, she quickly turns to mountaineering. And having received the certificate of a mountain guide, she soon begins to walk along the most difficult routes of France. And when Chantal was 22 years old, she took part in ice climbing competitions, which brought the strongest climbers in Europe. Moreover, she was the only female participant, and takes the third place out of 25 athletes at these competitions. Attention is paid to the spectacular climber. A promising athlete is accepted into the French National Mountaineering Association, where she quickly becomes a star. Chantal people literally breaks into the world of mountaineering. And then there were the Andes, where her first ascent above 5,000 meters took place. She not only ascended 6,000 meters, including Huascarán, 6,768 meters. She also descended from it on a paraglider. And, as Jennifer Jordan recalls, Chantal landed next to their group on a paraglider and made such an impression that one of the climbers invited her to take part in an expedition to Mount Everest, where she went in 1991. That year, she failed to reach the top, but she firmly decided that now she would only storm the 8,000th. Chantal was definitely a girl with ambitions. Moreover, these ambitions were great. The ascent was found without oxygen, and with minimal equipment, in the so-called alpine style. But in fairness, I must say that she endured being at a high altitude quite well. Here's what he will write: "Climb Everest, the roof of the world. A mountaineer's childhood dream. My dream. Without oxygen, without help. Like a cyclist climbing a mountain pass without a motor. Being at 8,000 meters without oxygen makes it possible to open up to the revival of feelings in these magical places of the Himalayas. A person experiences an extraordinary harmony with the earth, his inner horizons expand." And in those years, mountaineering was still a predominantly male occupation. There were, of course, strong climbers, such as Wanda Rudkovich and others, but they were still a minority. And, of course, the pretty French woman enjoyed incredible success in the base camps. Subsequently, many will accuse her of using her sexual attractiveness to manipulate male climbers. And, obviously, Chantal got some pleasure from the fact that men were competing for her. According to the memories of friends, she often deliberately provoked them. In some of her biographies, it is also noted that the woman had very free sexual mores. For example, during the second attempt to climb Mount Everest in the 91st year, Chantal's presence resulted in an open conflict between climbers. It got to the point that in pursuit of her attention, the men challenged each other to a duel with a fight and throwing stones. But for a while her attention was captured by the American climber Thor Kaiser, who was head over heels in love with Chantal. They start dating and even plan to climb Mount Fitzroy together in Argentina. It was quite an expensive climb, and in order to earn money for this trip, Chantal several times brought groups of tourists to the routes. But as the expedition approached, she told Thor that she had no money for a ticket. The climber, desperate to see her, took an extra job delivering pizza to pay for Chantal's tickets. A few months later, they set off. But during this route, Chantal suddenly cooled down to Thor, and their relationship began to crack at the seams. Although they still walked in one bundle and tried unsuccessfully to storm the top several times, Thor did not understand what was going on and tried by all means to regain the Frenchwoman's favor. And here's what Jennifer Jordan writes about it: "If we climb to the top today, everything will be fine between us," she told him before the next assault. Thor didn't understand why Vershina would change her attitude towards him, but he didn't care anymore. He only wanted to return her love. Thor felt that he would either take this girl to the top or die. He was in the lead for almost the entire route, correcting Chantal's minor mistakes. By 11 in the evening, he was passing a difficult section not far from the top. It was the 18th hour of ascent. The rain soaked them through. Thor was as tired as ever. Shoulders, arms, legs, everything seemed to be filled with lead. Nevertheless, Thor did not think to retreat. He's almost there. A few more meters and they are at the top. And everything will be fine. She promised. Already at night, he grabbed a decent-sized ledge and was already transferring weight to it when he felt that the stone began to move. Thor froze, but it was too late. The stone came out of the wall and fell into the abyss. Shouting a warning, he prayed that the stone would not hit Chantal, but the stone hit the rope and cut her like a thread. Thora was instantly torn away from the wall. Tumbling from rock to rock, he thought, well, at least I'm not dead yet. After 20 meters, he fell on a fairly wide platform, alive, but severely crippled. His eyelid was almost torn off his face, and his right arm was broken in several places. But he was alive. Other teams came to the rescue and lowered him to the base camp. And that was the end of Thor's ascent. But Chantal said she would keep trying. She was invited to join another team to go on the assault the next morning. I just don't love you anymore. That was all she said to him the next morning. And the American returns home, broken in every sense of the word. He is traumatized physically and mentally, and even begins to go to a psychologist, who recommends that he no longer intersect with this woman. But as soon as Thor finds out that Chantal is starting to prepare for climbing K2, he immediately starts looking for a place in the team. And Thor joins the Russian-American expedition, which included the strongest climbers of his time. Ed Visters, by the way, is of Latvian origin, the famous mountaineer Scott Fischer and Vladimir Balaburden. Chantal was part of the Swiss team. Their route on K2 was in Pakistan. As you know, this is a Muslim country with fairly strict rules. However, Chantal was in no hurry to comply with local regulations. She walked around the bazaars alone, and in short shorts, which several times almost got into big trouble. However, after 19 days, she and her team still arrive at the base camp of Mount K2, where they begin to prepare for the ascent. Moreover, they were going to ascend in the alpine style, that is, with minimal equipment and without ropes. This is a very important point, as a result of which they do not help other climbers to hang ropes, and do not waste their strength on it. However, later other climbers saw how the Swiss fastened themselves into their ropes and, accordingly, enjoyed the fruits of their labors, which is not very fair. Chantal herself hated carrying heavy backpacks. The men of her team carried tents, primuses, fuel and food to set up intermediate camps, and her backpack was extremely small, with a plush duck on the frame and the absence of anything heavy inside. She enjoyed the attention of men to avoid stress. It seemed to many then that the Swiss team was not able to climb to the top. And a few weeks later, Chantal felt it too. She distanced herself from her own and became close to Americans Ed Vesters and Scott Fischer, as if betting on another horse. In their team, as we remember, there was also Thor Kaiser, whom she did not seem to notice. After some time, the Swiss decided to storm the summit, but were stopped by a storm, returned to the base camp, packed up and went home, saying that there were too many people on the mountain. And according to the law of Pakistan, which prohibits climbers from moving from one group to another, Chantal also had to go home with the Swiss. Chantal did not want to leave without a serious attempt to storm, and then Turkaiser offers her to join their team and climb the mountain together, despite violations of Pakistani laws. Obviously, the climber wanted to return the Frenchwoman's favor by any means. However, while Thor Kaiser was hanging ropes, carrying equipment to base camps, and so on, Chantal began sleeping with his partner Ed Wisters, and in general, she led a rather dissolute life at base camp, according to eyewitnesses. And finally, on the 28th of July, Kaiser, Wisters, Neil Beidelman left the base camp to storm the summit. They reached the third camp by the 30th of July. Vladimir Balaburden and Gennady Kopejka were 300 meters taller. Wisters and Beidelman were sleeping in the same tent, and Thor was sleeping separately, when at night he suddenly heard footsteps. It was Chantal. After waiting for the men to leave the base camp, she quietly put on her crampons, filled a bottle with water, and went upstairs light. After the meeting, they continued climbing together. Wisters and Beidelman said they didn't like the weather and started going down. The rest of the climbers continue climbing. On the 31st of July, it was clear that he carried a very heavy load: a tent, a primus, a sleeping bag, food and ropes. After some time, they were forced to leave some of the equipment. They leave their sleeping bags, rope, most of the food, and then it becomes easier to move. But the night stops them. After a bivouac without sleeping bags, Thor frostbitten his feet. Chantal, despite her thin jumpsuit, seemed insensitive to the cold and very well tolerated the height. In general, many people have noted this feature of it. She quickly acclimatized and, unlike many men, felt at ease at height. After a cold night, Thor decides to go down for equipment and bring his sleeping bag. Chantal said, "Since you're coming down anyway, bring my sleeping bag." And the climber obediently brought 2 sleeping bags. And, going down for sleeping bags, Thor meets climber Alexei Nikiforov, who also climbed without a sleeping bag, in the hope of reaching the 4th camp. Then they went together. Thor was glad of Alexei's help in laying a path in the deep snow. And on this day, the climbers did not have time to reach the 4th camp, and they were forced to spend the night on the shoulder of the mountain by 2. Alexei lay down between the sleeping bags of Chantal and Thor, and they spent a relatively normal night. The next morning, continuing the ascent. On the 2nd of August, the Troika reaches the 4th camp. There they meet Biloberden and Kopeka coming down. They were the first to reach the summit along the Abruzzi Ridge since 1986. After spending the night at an altitude of 8,600 meters, they were almost exhausted. They leave the tent and sleeping bag to Alexei and tend to go down. And finally, the time of their ascent comes. Torkaiser woke up before dawn and began to pave the path in half a meter of snow. Alexei followed him. But 200 meters before the top, Thor realizes that he has no chance to climb up and go down alive. He spent all his strength on paving the path. And here's what Jennifer Jordan writes about it. Thor sat down on the ridge, trying to make out Chantal and Alexei below, so that he could hand over the work of laying the trail to him. They were still small figures far below. Thor tried to cry, but his body was unable to obey even the simplest commands. Suddenly a strong, clear voice pierced his brain. "If you want to live, go down." Then he looked around. There was no one around. But he got up and started down. Chantal was the last to leave the camp. Walking along the paved path, she quickly caught up with Alexei in a bottle throat. She walked around him and met Thor coming down. "Thor, come upstairs with me. We will ascend together." And, of course, the temptation was great. But Thor didn't change his mind, because he just didn't have the strength left. "Whatever happens, you know you're a nice guy," Chantal told him. He replied that he would wait for her at the 4th camp. And this retreat of Thor will save not only him, but also the lives of Chantal and Alexei. And starting the descent, Torkaiser will find 50 meters of rope at the top of the bottle neck, which Alexei threw. Deciding that he would no longer need it, Thor stopped, fixed the rope on the ice, and made a railing in the most dangerous part of the bottle neck, so that Chantal and Alexei could safely descend. Meanwhile, Chantal, who did not waste her energy on carrying things to base camps, hanging ropes, a path in deep snow, with her small backpack, and a truly magical acclimatization at 5 in the evening on the 3rd of August 1992, becomes the 4th woman to climb to the top of K2. And it was really a great achievement. She was at the peak of her climbing success. K2, also known as Killer Mountain, is one of the most technically challenging peaks. But her exultation did not last long. On the rise, she lost her sunglasses. Her eyes were left unprotected from the cold, small pieces of ice flying in the air, and most importantly, from the solar ultraviolet, which at such a height burns out the eyes in a matter of minutes. And being at the top, the climber realizes that she is blind, and she can no longer go down on her own. Fearing that she would not be able to traverse the traverse alone, she climbed into a snow cave dug 2 days ago by Berdini, and began to freeze. She couldn't go down on her own, because she just couldn't see where to go. She couldn't survive another cold night at this altitude. And by some miracle, Alexei, who was descending from the top and stumbled upon a freezing climber, will find her in this cave. He will make her get up and begin to lower her down. Chantal couldn't see anything anymore. Frostbitten hands and feet, and constantly fell asleep on the move. Alexei had to constantly lift the exhausted climber. And then a rope hung by Thor comes to the rescue. Alexei was fastened into a rope, but when he shifted his weight from one foot to the other, the cat broke away from the shoe and he lost his balance. He flew a few meters until the rope stopped. And if not for these railings hung by the Taurus, both climbers would have remained on the mountain forever. When Alexei reached the tent, he was in a state close to death from altitude sickness, physical exhaustion, and cold. He literally fell into Thor's tent. "Where's Chantal?" Thor asked. "She was walking behind me," Alexei replied. 45 minutes later, Thor heard the crunch of snow and uncertain footsteps. With her arms outstretched like a child playing blind man's buff, Chantal tried to find her way down. She could not see anything and was in a semi-conscious state, but continued to go down. He dragged her into the tent, pulled off her shoes, and found that her feet were severely frostbitten, but they could still be warmed up. He quickly brewed tea and soup and fed them chocolate. After spending 3 days in the fourth camp, above the so-called death zone, above 8,000 meters, Thor Kaiser realized that his time was coming to an end. At this altitude, even resting, it is impossible to restore strength. And no matter how strong you are, you're still slowly dying. And now he had not only to descend himself, but also to lower to half-dead climbers. But in spite of everything, all 3 climbers began the descent the next afternoon. Alexei Thor was supported by Chantal's arms. She could barely move her legs. They carried it a few meters and sat down on the ground to rest. Then they rose again, and so endlessly. In 3 hours, they had walked no more than 60 meters. Thor was worried that driving Chantal down a technically difficult slope at night would be tantamount to suicide. He decides to pitch a tent. Chantal sat motionless in the snow. Alexei, who apparently valued his own life, decides to continue the descent, leaving Chantal and her salvation Torah. And Thor Kaiser, together with Chantal, are preparing for another overnight stay, and meet the 6th day at an altitude of more than 8,000 meters. The next day the weather was great, and Thor radioed with Wisters and Fisher in the 3rd camp. They said that Alexei got to them last night, and they are ready to meet him and help to lower Chantal. While climbing, Wisters and Fisher saw an avalanche-prone slope, and for safety, they tied up with a rope. After walking a little away from the camp, Wisters suddenly felt the hairs on his neck stand on end from a sense of approaching danger. He immediately rushed to dig a cave, hoping to bury himself under the avalanche before it started. Fisher looked at him and did not understand what was happening. Suddenly, without warning, he was hit by a wall of ice and snow, and was thrown down the slope from a great height. Wisters heard the crunch of the snow layer and looked up at the moment when Fisher was knocked down by a wall of snow. Wisters dived into the hole he had dug, and the avalanche passed on horseback. But the happiness was short-lived. The rope tightened, and he was pulled out of the hole, like a fish on a fishing line, and dragged 100 meters down the slope. With all his might, he tried to slow down with an ice pick. In the end, he succeeded. He caught on a rock, and they hung a few meters from the abyss. None of them were injured, and they continued to climb in order to save Chantal. All the while, Thor continued to slowly lower Chantal on the rope. A few hours later, he meets with Wisters and Fisher. But by this point, Chantal was completely exhausted. Wisters immediately opened his backpack and threw himself on his knees in front of Chantal, saying that he had brought eye drops. He carefully lifted her glasses and saw her swollen, red eyes from burst blood vessels. Together, they continued their descent to the 3rd camp. 2 more days, they went down to the 1st camp, and at the end Chantal felt better. So much so that I was able to descend on my own. Always cautious, Wisters recalls that climbing Katu was the only time in his life when he acted with his strict rule to always stay safe. Moreover, in her memoirs about climbing K2, Chantal says almost nothing about her poor condition. She casually mentions that her eyes hurt, and that's it. But she tells in detail how she was met at the base camp, as if she were a heroine. Here's what she writes: Charlie came with tea and cookies, and I fell into his arms. The Mexicans congratulated me, and the sweetness of the warmth of human ties filled me to the brim. And the only one Chantal didn't mention in her memoirs was the mountaineer Thor Kaiser. Not a word is said about him there. Upon returning down, she was waiting for a hefty fine for unauthorized climbing, which the climber simply tore up and left Pakistan. By the way, mountaineer Gennady Kopejka, in his article in memory of Alexei Nikiforov, who later died on Everest, also bypasses the role of Thor Kaiser in saving Chantal. Thor Lish is casually mentioned as an unnamed American who turned back before reaching the top. The role of Chantal's main savior, Kopejka assigns to Alexei, who, according to him, accompanied Chantal until other climbers arrived. Nikiforov himself claimed that Chantal did not reach the top because she did not calculate her strength. But she was still credited with climbing. After the death of Wanda Rudkovich, Chant remained the only woman who returned alive from the top of K2. She was greeted in France as a folk hero. They no longer maintained relations with Thor. In the mountaineering community, Chantal has earned an ambiguous reputation. Many accused her of using men for her own ascents, not caring much about their safety and life in general. She even gets the nickname Black Widow. However, here's what mountaineer Dan Mazur writes about it. Chantal was the antithesis of all this climbing mafia shit about big sponsors and tons of support from the Sherpas. She just loved the mountains. And all these guys, vilifying her behind her back, they just wanted to sleep with her. She really used her body to establish influence over men. And why not? She had the character of a winner. She wasn't always cheerful and joyful, her knee hurt, it was badly damaged, she wasn't always in good shape, but she was very strong. Sometimes she pushed herself too far. And this dubious success on K2 allows us to Chantal Mauduit sponsors, and in the spring of 1993 year, together with the New Zealand team, to return to Everest. And although there were 9 climbers and 8 high-altitude Sherpas in her team, for some reason she claimed that she was climbing alone. And much faster than her friends. This was another comment that caused terrible irritation to others. She reached a height of 8,400, but she moved too slowly, was not dressed warmly enough, and decided to turn down. Preferring a long life with fingers to irreversible frostbite, she returned to the Nepalese side of Everest with the Spanish team in the fall of the same year. But this time, it only reached a height of 8,000 meters. Without official permission, she and Pamba Sherpa decided to illegally enter the peaks of Shishapangma and Cho'oyu. And moreover, they successfully ascend to both peaks in October. Upon returning to Kathmandu, Chantal and I were again fined for illegal climbing. But without paying anything, she returned to France and scolded the Himalayan bureaucracy for a long time. And then Chantal goes to Mount Williams in Antarctica, where a film is being made about her. After that, she returns to Mount Everest, this time to the previously unexplored Northeast Ridge. This time, having already gained popularity, she was a paid client of the Russell Bryce expedition. Avalanches made the passage of the route impossible, and Chantal and other clients simply ran out of steam. And the expedition returned home. In 1995, she goes to Mount Everest again, as a member of Rob Hall's expedition to the Southeast Ridge. Chantal reaches the southern peak, and a height of 8,750 meters. Before turning back. Or rather, before it was turned. Chantal was the slowest of Rob's clients during the entire climb. When she stopped at the South Peak, Rob put his hand on her shoulder, demanding that she turn down. The climber looked at him. Her lips were blue and numb, her eyes unfocused. She nodded softly, unable to protest or even speak. After walking 30 meters down, she fell on the slope and lost consciousness. Hall realized that he would have to drag her down. And again, at the cost of incredible efforts and dangers to their own lives, several climbers lowered Chantal from the mountain. By the way, among them was Ed Wisters, who saved Chantal for the second time. The climber was lowered to the tents, where she was given first aid. And Chantal recovered very quickly. The next day, she continued her usual fun at the base camp and walked as if nothing had happened. Rob Hall came back in a rage and said that he dragged Chantal like a sack of potatoes, and that she was permanently banned from participating in his expeditions. Chantal has earned a reputation as a climber who constantly needs to be rescued, and who constantly endangers the lives of other climbers. She has already been openly called the Black Widow. And indeed, many climbers, saving Chantal, lost the opportunity to climb, and some risked their lives. That's how Thor Kaiser remembers it. Chantal didn't take care of herself. She wasn't thinking about safety. I climbed with her because I loved her, not because it was safe. Chantal was a sort of Trojan Helen. She infuriated and inspired thousands of climbers. In 1994, the French magazine Vertically wrote about her like this: Chantal's problem is that her ascents look too easy for us to take them seriously. And when the English climber Alison Hargreaves died on K2, Chantal said the following words: I admire her. But look, we are different. At least in the fact that I'm still alive. And after 6 unsuccessful attempts to climb Mount Everest, Chantal switches to Mount Lowes, which at that time there were no female ascents. In 1996, she goes there with the American team. But during the assault on the summit, the weather deteriorates, a hurricane begins, a blizzard, and all of her satellites turn down. However, Chantal remains on the mountain, continues the assault, and, according to her, becomes the first woman on the top of Lhotse. However, we have no evidence of this. She ascended alone, there were no witnesses, and she did not bring any photos from the top, saying that the camera was frozen. A strong wind was blowing, and she hurried down. And many climbers, to put it mildly, doubt this ascent. For reference, the weather was really terrible. On this day, Rob Hall and Scott Fisher die on Everest, and Bucrive saves several climbers. And at the same time, Chantal ascends alone on the collective farm. Well, many climbers doubted. And after the Lhotse, Chantal makes an ascent to the Monaslu mountain. The French press immediately dubbed her the greatest mountaineer of our time. That's how they remember Thor Kaiser. She had power over men. She joked like this: too much man, too little time. Repeatedly, her former lovers approached her, looking at her like a wolf at a sheep. She looked them straight in the face and said, "Oh, I'm sorry, I don't remember, have we met?" And finally, we come to a very strange denouement of this story, in the 98th year, on Mount Dhaulagiri. She was climbing with her partner Anxi Ring Sherpa, who was more of a friend than a paid porter. They set up a tent in the second camp, not far from the tents of the Italian team. Franco Brunella warned Chantal about a crack higher up the route. She thanked him and locked herself in a tent with a Sherpa. That was the last time they were seen alive. The Italians decided to go down to wait out the snowfall. Before leaving, they saw Chantal's half-buried tent, but did not approach it. 5 days later, they returned and saw that the tent was in the same condition. Worried, they dug up the snow and found Chantal and Sherpa dead in their sleeping bags. Chantal had a deformed jaw and a broken neck. The Sherpa apparently just suffocated, and it's not hard to guess that this death seemed strange to many. They did not die on the ascent, but in the base camp, in their own tent. It is assumed that an ice block fell on them. But there were no witnesses, no one saw it, and no one really knows what happened there. Chantal's body was transported to France, where he was cremated. And she, by the way, wrote a huge will about how she should be buried with detailed instructions. For example, after the Mass, Chantal's loud laughter was heard in the air, recorded by her specifically for this occasion. And her will has not yet been fulfilled. She wanted her ashes to be scattered in so many places that her relatives have not yet visited them all. This is an interesting, ambiguous, and very confusing story. Whatever you think about her, write in the comments. Don't forget to like, don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you haven't subscribed yet. I know a lot of people watch me without a subscription, it's no good. Please click on the subscribe button, it's not difficult for you, but it will be nice for me. You can also recommend this video to your friends. I remind you that you can support me on Boost, Patreon, with a paid subscription on YouTube, or with a one-time donation. Links to these resources can be found in the description under this video. And many thanks to everyone who has already responded and supported me. This is really very important for the existence of this channel. And Vladimir Chaikin was with you for now.